Hello everybody, welcome back. We are going through our first chapter of notes for intermediate macroeconomics. This is actually chapter 2 from our book, Macroeconomics by Mankiw. And in the last video, we looked at GDP. We started to introduce GDP. What does it mean? What does it measure? What was the definition? And what was included within that definition? So really quickly, GDP is the market value of all final goods and services produced within a country in a given period of time. Okay, and we talked about the things that doesn't include, like used items and imputed value goods and services, things produced at home and in formal markets. And then talked briefly about this idea of value added. We don't want to include intermediate goods in our calculations of GDP, because if we do, they're going to end up being double counted. We only want to include that final good or final service. And the last thing we did was look at this nuanced difference between gross domestic product and gross national product, where we're going to emphasize GDP, which is everything produced within the borders of a country, regardless of whether or not the firm is an American firm for American GDP. If it's produced within the borders of a country, that is going to be our GDP, gross domestic product calculation. Okay, in this next video here, we are going to be looking at the components of GDP, going through a few examples and looking at nominal versus real GDP, which will then bring us up to our next video after this, where we're going to start talking a little bit about inflation, a little review of inflation. Okay, so for now, let's jump in to the components of GDP. So we're going to say Y as our variable for GDP, and this is composed of 4 primary categories: C plus I plus G plus NX. Okay, and each of those stand for something different. C is consumption. And we're going to go into each of these as we go. Consumption. I is investment. G is government spending. And finally, NX, which is equal to X minus M, is equal to net exports. Right, or exports minus imports. Okay, and so because we talked last time about how national GDP is national income, it's total expenditure, it's all of those things all at once. Ultimately, once we start talking about policy later on, whether it's fiscal policy through Congress or monetary policy through the Federal Reserve System, central banking system, in order to kind of stimulate the economy and also to stimulate economic growth, we're going to be thinking about in what ways can we increase these variables. And if we do increase those variables, then theoretically, GDP should increase as well. So we're looking to increase these, and that's the type of stuff we'll be talking about in the next chapter. But for now, let's kind of understand what each of these include. We're going to start with consumption, which is spending by households on goods and services. One important item of note is that consumption does not include housing, so excludes new housing. That's actually going to be put into investment because it's a large capital structure. So otherwise, it includes goods and services, as we've talked about before, G&S, goods and services. And within each of those, it breaks down goods and services into multiple categories. We're going to do that to a small degree, but within the Bureau of Economic Analysis data, it really breaks it down to a very large degree. So let me write that here, BEA, Bureau of Economic Analysis. This is where you can get GDP data, and we'll look at some GDP data, but it'll break down GDP into consumption, investment, government spending, net exports, and all the component parts like we're seeing here. So within goods, we have durable and non-durable. Durable goods move with the business cycle. These are usually larger ticket items, things where if you have a lot of extra money on hand because the economy has been doing well, you're going to be more likely to buy them. When the economy turns down, you're going to be less likely to buy them. So a first good example of this would be cars. If the economy is doing well, people are more likely to buy cars, or trade in an old one, get a new one, things like that. But when the economy turns down, a lot fewer car purchases, especially new car purchases. Okay, so cars, for an example, furniture, and let's put appliances in there too. So, in fact, these are the types of large ticket items, and they really are kind of durable items that last a while. And there are many more than this, but these types of items tend to move with the business cycle. When the economy is going up, purchases of these types of items go up and vice versa. On the other hand, we have non-durable items. These do not move with the business cycle. The consumption of these is pretty constant across time, and it's largely necessities. So certainly something like food, toiletries, medicine, and let's just put etc. But if you need, for example, medicine for something, and that's something you truly need, it doesn't matter whether the economy is doing well or doing poorly, that consumption is going to be pretty smooth throughout the entire business cycle. Same with food, toilet paper, things like that. So non-durable items do not move with the business cycle, and again, usually these are necessities. Okay, services we're going to leave as a broad category, but these are going to include things from lawyers and bankers and kind of white-collar jobs and things like that, to jobs like waiters and waitresses, right? Hotel receptionists, clerks, any type of service industry where it's not an actual good that's being produced, but a service. And so this also, depending on the service, varies significantly with the business cycle and kind of what ways the economy is being affected. We'll look at some data related to that later as well. So that was consumption, goods and services from households. Investment is the spending or the purchasing on capital equipment, structures, and inventories, primarily by firms, but also the new housing that we talked about from consumption. So this is a consumer purchase, but it gets counted within investment. Okay, because it's a structure. So here we're talking about machines, buildings, factories, warehouses, large equipment, things like that. And generally, again, it's primarily business spending. The one thing I don't want you to get confused on yet, or at all, is investment not being the investment you might think of as a retail investment in the stock market, right? Financial investments, these are something different, which we will talk about later in the course. But for GDP purposes, investment does not include the stock market or any other kind of financial market. Okay, that's investment, I. G is government spending. And a lot of the same stuff here, but now it's just spending by the government, whether it's the local government, state, or federal government. Any spending that they're doing, this gets counted in government. So some big ones would be infrastructure. Here we're thinking about roads, sewers, etc. Number of bridges, number of infrastructure type projects that governments are funding. A lot of educational funding comes from the government. Education, defense, whether that's at a local level with a police force or at a national level with military, for example, and numerous other government spending as well. Okay, so one last thing to note here on government spending is that we don't include something like a lot of taxes are just redistributed. So redistributive, where we tax some group of people and then we provide services with that tax money to another group of people. If it's just a transfer payment, for example, if you tax a rich person and you take some of that money and you give it to poor people, that is not new production. That is not included in GDP. That's just a transfer. So remember, GDP is only measuring new production. So any type of transfer, whether it's Social Security, unemployment insurance, or other social programs that are transfer-based, that is not included in GDP. Okay, government spending. And our last one is net exports. In X, as we saw, was exports minus imports, and I'll just write that out. Exports minus imports. Exports are things coming in, imports are things, that's opposite. Exports are things going out, imports are things coming in. The United States is a net importing country. Okay, and when we're calculating GDP, we want to make sure that we don't get credit for any imported good because we didn't make it. So as an example here, if we're thinking about an American household buying a German Volkswagen from Germany. So what's going to happen here in our GDP calculation? Well, net exports is going to go down. Right? Because we imported something. If we have EX minus IM, let's say net exports is equal to EX minus IM. If imports go up, which they will when we import a Volkswagen, net exports will go down. So net exports goes down, but the American consumed some new item. So net exports goes down, consumption goes up, so GDP remains unchanged. Consumption goes up, no change in investment or government spending, but net exports went down. So the overall effect on American GDP, so again, keep that in mind, we're talking about US GDP, is fixed, or that's what I have this Y bar for no change. Okay, no change. Right, and that's because the US should not receive credit for the German production. Okay, and so that's why we need to subtract out any imports that come in, because those are going to ultimately end up getting consumed, and those need to be canceled out. Okay. So let's let's move to the next page where we're actually going to see some GDP from 2019. So this is July 26th, 2019, quarter two GDP. The total GDP is up here in the gray. That's 100% of everything. And then you can look through here. I'd actually have you pause the video to do at least the little gray bars. C plus I. Here we have C, personal consumption expenditure. I, gross domestic private investment. G, government spending essentially, and net exports. Okay, and again, this comes from the Bureau of Economic Analysis. So look, maybe pause the video, do a quick calculation to see the shares of GDP within each of the main subcategories, and then come back and we'll see what they are. So if you calculate those, you should come out to about 68% in consumption, 17.6% for investment, 17.5% for government spending, and negative 3.1% for net exports. 3.1. Let me make sure that's clear. Okay, so clearly consumption makes up the largest part of American GDP, and it has for decades. Investment and government spending are about the same at about 17%, and net exports here are negative 3.1%, and that's because here's imports, 3.1 trillion, and exports at 2.5 trillion. We import more than we export. Imports are greater than exports, and that's why our net exports are negative and make up this kind of strange negative share of the total. Okay, that's all summarized here in these questions. Calculate the shares, we did that. Which component has the largest share? Consumption. Why are net exports negative? Imports greater than exports. And then just take some time to go back up or backwards in the video to look at the graph and just see if there's anything else interesting to you. I guess the one thing I'll point out that is maybe not something everyone would expect is within government spending, we actually have more state and local spending than we do federal spending. So state and local 2.3 trillion, federal 1.4 trillion. And I'm saying trillion because, again, up here at the top, these are all in billions of dollars. So 1,000 billion is a trillion. So like 1,400 billion is 1.4 trillion. Okay, so anyway, you can take a look through there. Again, you see it broken down from in goods and services, and as we did here, we looked at durable and non-durable. The residential investment is the houses, the new homes, but you can see make up just kind of a small percentage of that whole subcategory of investment. It's mostly the business spending, and then government spending and net exports there at the bottom. So take a look at that, see if you find anything interesting, and if you want to go to see the most recent data, you can go out to the Bureau of Economic Analysis and find that. Okay. So we'll touch on real GDP versus nominal GDP, and the use of real versus nominal GDP is going to lead us nicely into one of our measures of inflation, the GDP price deflator. And so we'll talk about real and nominal GDP here for the last part of this video, and then we'll jump into the next video on inflation. So for now, real GDP, we're going to be adjusting the GDP number by a base year. So in a way, if we're looking at constant prices, we could look at the year 2000 GDP, we could look at 2010, 2020, 2030. But because we have inflation every year, $1 today is not going to be the same as $1 next year. And what we do is we pick a base year, say the base year of 2000, and we value everything at constant prices. So we could, for example, look at 2010 GDP measured in 2000, in the year $2000. Same with 2020, same with 2030, so on and so forth. Okay, whereas nominal GDP, we're measuring in current prices. So there we don't use a base year. If we're looking at nominal GDP for the year 2000, that's measured in the year 2000 prices. If we're looking at nominal GDP in 2010, it's used the 2010 prices, and so on and so forth. So it's just whether or not there's a base year, and it's essentially controlling for inflation. Okay, so let's try to explore this in a little more detail, and we're going to do an example which will, I think, help as well. If we're thinking about expenditure, and because GDP measured in different ways, but one of them equally the same as the others is total expenditure. Why might one spend more this month compared to last month? Well, there are really kind of two simple ways. One, you might buy more, which we'll call the quantity effect. Or you might pay more. You might buy the same amount of stuff, but pay more, and that's the price effect. Okay, essentially inflation. Okay, and essentially we want to control for this price effect to have an accurate measure, especially as we're looking across time. Any time we're looking across time, real GDP is the measurement to use to make accurate comparisons. Real GDP is going to give us this, and let's look at an example here to kind of show what's going on. So calculating nominal GDP is easy. Remember, if we're looking at nominal GDP, we always use the prices for that year. So if we want to calculate the nominal GDP for the year 2000, we can look at the price times the quantity, how much money we've spent total on ice cream, $100, plus the total expenditure on pretzels, $1 times 100 pretzels. And so we can do that down here as well. We spent $2 for 50 ice creams, plus $1 for 100 pretzels. Okay, and that's just equal to 100 plus 100 for 200. Okay, price times quantity plus price times quantity. And for nominal GDP, it's always the same. So again, let's do one more together, and I'll leave the last one for you to try. 3 times 100. For 2001, we use 2001 prices. The price is $2 for a pretzel in 2001. And we're buying 150. Okay, that's going to come out to 300 plus 300 for 600. Okay, and I'll leave 2002 for you to do. And then let's calculate real GDP. So we're going to, whenever we calculate real GDP, we have to have a base year. We're saying here that it's the year 2000. That means we're always going to use the 2000 prices. So that actually makes the calculation of 2000 GDP really easy. Whenever you're using the base year, it's just the same as it is with nominal GDP. So it's $200. We can see that by calculating it really quickly. We keep the same prices for the year 2000. And we bought 50 ice creams, plus $1 per pretzel for 100 pretzels. And again, that comes out to 200. Now the big difference is for the base year, we always use, or for the real GDP, we always use base year prices. So we use 2 here, and we use 1 here. And that's not going to change. So I'm not going to do the third one again, but you just make sure anytime you're using real GDP calculations, you always use the same base year prices. Okay, so let's continue calculating 2001 real GDP. $2, but now in 2001 we bought 100 ice creams, 100 ice creams for $2 each at the base year prices, and 150 pretzels. Okay, so we have 200 plus 150 for 350. Okay, so instead of the real GDP being 600, nominal GDP is 600, but the real GDP is 350. And so in this way, we can make a more accurate comparison in how much the real kind of cost of living, purchasing power has gone up in an economy over time. Okay, so the prices have gone up, but you're also buying more. And so as long as we control for one of those effects, we can have this accurate real GDP comparison across time. Okay, yeah, we're going to talk more about this idea of real GDP in the future. In fact, in the next video, once we're starting to talk about inflation and the GDP deflator, which comes back to this idea of nominal and real GDP. And tying those two this video and the next video together with some context between the two of them, because this is when inflation and GDP start to become very interconnected. And we'll see later that also inflation and unemployment are interconnected. So the whole economy, it's all in this complex system with, interconnected relationships. But yeah, so let me just re-emphasize that anytime we're looking at time trends, we want to be using real GDP. Nominal GDP is fine if you're looking at one point in time, but also potentially cross-country comparisons. And let's just put in parentheses at one point in time. In that case, you could use nominal GDP. But in most contexts, when we're thinking about macroeconomic measurement, real GDP usually gives us what we want. So let's leave it here for now. Finishing up that last bit on GDP, and pick it up in the next video regarding inflation.